The therapist is now required to agree with you on pain of license loss. So beware, everyone listening and watching, because that's now the law in many places. You said your therapist accepted the idea that you should be a boy pretty damn rapidly. I should also point out to everyone who's listening, that's actually now mandatory by law. So in many jurisdictions. So now, because of standards of gender affirming care, therapists are required, if you say something like you're a girl, you say something like, well, I'm a boy, the therapist is now required to agree with you on pain of license loss. So beware, everyone listening and watching, because that's now the law in many places. And so to me, that's the end of psychotherapy, because all psychotherapy is a questioning approach fundamentally, to find out what the problem is and then to try to work towards, well, first of all, non-harmful solutions. So I would have, with you, for example, I would have explored some of the realm of alternative forms of beauty. That would have been a nice thing to walk you through to some degree, so you could see more of what the range was of acceptable and admirable physiological types. Because that, I don't know for sure that we would have done that, but we might have, because that would have been good for you to get a broader picture of attractiveness, right? And then also to tell you about the fact that a lot of the misery that you were experiencing was, well, par for the course for females at puberty, but also exacerbated by your temperamental proclivities. And so that might have helped you calm down a bit, right? Because you get a bit of an explanation for your misery that way, and also some hope that you'd kind of grow out of it with time. So, okay, so you went to the therapist and he more or less agreed with your prognosis and diagnosis that you were a boy. Okay, so was the therapeutic process of any utility to you?
No, he didn't really do anything, actually. I was actually pretty dissatisfied with him. I did have some stuff going on at home and at school that he just never went into. The full picture of my mental health wasn't really explored at all, actually, throughout the course of my transition. And a lot of what I mentioned, I didn't even know was a problem until recently, until well after I stopped transitioning, and I was old enough to really be able to introspect well enough to figure out where it all stemmed from. But it was never explored by the adults who put me on this path.
Okay, so what did they, how often did you go see your therapist, and what actually happened during the so-called therapeutic process?
I would say maybe about once a week to once every 2 weeks. And, I would talk about, it's hard to remember so far back, but I remember nothing really ever came out of the appointments. I would tell him my phone got taken away and I don't really have any contact with the outside world, for example. And he would just be like, oh, okay, how are you dealing with that? And I'd be like, not very well. And he would just say, okay, and not really do anything about it, not really offer me anything at all. And eventually, I'd say after maybe a month or so, he maybe got fired, or he transferred somewhere else because he wasn't there anymore. And then I got sent to another therapist. And roughly around that time, I expressed to my parents that, I'm not really satisfied. I want to go through with a medical transition. I want to go on hormones. And they actually pushed back on this at first. They were very cautious of this. They didn't know why I was pushing for it so much. And they wanted me to wait a little bit, because at this point in time, I was only 13 years old. I was quite young to be doing such a thing. And they stayed that way until I got my gender dysphoria diagnosis. And during one of the appointments that they were there for, I can't remember who exactly it was. It was either a therapist or a nurse, I think. Somebody who was involved in my transition. They told them that, this is pretty much the only means of treating dysphoria. There was no regards to any alternative treatments. My dad asked about the regret rates, and they said they didn't even, I don't think they even used the word detransition. They said there's less than a 1 to 2% regret rate. And
Yeah.
they also told my parents that if I wasn't allowed to go through with this, then I would be at risk of suicide.
Okay, so I want to take all of that apart, okay? Because every single one of those statements is a lie. So first of all, the American Psychological Association, in their guidelines for gender-affirming treatment, makes the case that, and because of prejudice, that there are no good long-term follow-up studies of transgender individuals. Okay, and they attribute that to prejudice against transgender individuals, which is not the reason, by the way. The reason is that there's a very low base rate, or there was, of transgender dysphoria, and the follow-up studies haven't been done in large part because the surgical and hormonal treatment regimen is relatively new. But there are no good long-term follow-up studies, and they actually complain about that. And then a couple pages later in the same document, they say that, well, it's necessary to affirm an alternate gender identity because otherwise the client or patient is at heightened risk of suicide. Okay, so first of all, both of those things can't be true. There's no way that people can know that suicide risk is elevated if gender transition is delayed unless the long-term studies are in place. And they already stated that the bloody long-term studies aren't in place. So that's all just a lie, but it's worse than that. It's way worse than that. You see, gender dysphoria is a variant of the suffering that's associated with negative emotion, depression and anxiety. Now, depression and anxiety are the primary drivers of suicidal ideation, not gender dysphoria per se. And so they're confusing the source. Now and then there is no evidence whatsoever that transition of the medical sort actually has a salutary effect on mental health, partly because the long-term studies simply haven't been done. And the idea that we actually know from a research perspective that a child is much safer if they start transition than they are if they don't. That's just, again, that's simply not true. Ken Zucker's work has showed quite clearly that if you just leave the kids alone, then by the time they're 18 or 19, most of them settle into their biological identities. Now, so the reason I'm stressing this is because your parents, like many parents in this situation, were put in a very, very difficult position. And I would say it's corrupt to the point of malevolence, what the medical professionals are doing on this front. And that is the insistence, well, would you rather have a live trans child or a dead child? Which is, I don't think there's anything more toxic you can say to a parent than that, because that backs them into a corner. Because their alternatives are then, well, you can let your child go ahead with this absolutely life-altering hormonal and then surgical treatment, or your child can die, and it's your fault because you don't care enough. And parents, they're accustomed to trusting their medical professionals, at least to some degree, and accustomed to assuming that the knowledge they put forward is valid and reliable. And the information that your family was given was none of those. In fact, it's pathological to a degree that's almost imaginable. It's criminal, in my estimation, what you were told. Because there is simply no evidence that any of that is the case. There's no evidence that transitioning kids are less likely to be suicidal. There's no evidence that that's the only treatment path that works. And there's certainly no evidence that there's no alternative to transition or suicide. It's so pathological, I can't believe it, but it's no wonder your parents were pushed into a corner, because that's a dreadful choice for a parent to have to make.
Yeah, they were definitely coerced into it. And after that, they obviously were more open to the idea of me being medicalized, and my gender specialist decided to refer me to an endocrinologist. The first one who I saw actually was the only person who really pushed back on this. After the appointment, he said, you're very young, you're 13, and this could have some negative implications for your brain development going forward. So I think it's something that should wait. I'm not going to prescribe these to you. And after that, I was just referred to another endocrinologist who, after about 2 or 3 appointments, gave me the consent forms for blockers. I started about a month after that, and then I had another appointment to sign off on the forms for testosterone. And my mom also had to sign off on them. This was around late 2017, early 2018, and I don't know if it's still true now that you need your parents to, if you're a minor, to sign off on forms for hormones or anything like that, because they're trying to push for kids being able to independently make that choice.